All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this MPA4 pandemic presentation. My name is Callen Feeney. This presentation is a collaboration effort between myself and Nathan Smarcz. So we're going to walk you through some evidence that we found and how this pandemic affected things like assessment. So a little overview on what we're going to be talking about today is the Great Shutdown, how COVID-19 changed the world, how this pandemic changed the world, causing the transition of schools to online learning. What did that look like? What challenges did teachers face trying to figure out what we do in this online learning? And that included formal and informal assessments. How do we assess these students? And that includes that formal and informal that I mentioned, as well as high stakes standardized testing. And we're going to look at more challenges that affected the assessment. And those include things like stress and anxiety. We all face that during the pandemic. Those students are no exception. And we're going to look at that and talk about that because that's important in understanding how to assess our students. And I'm going to talk about a push for formative assessments. A lot of new things came out of this pandemic, so it's important to reflect on that and understand how the technology we used during this time in online learning, were the students able to absorb the information we were giving to them. So there was a big push for formative. We're going to talk about that. And we're talking about where we go from here. What considerations should we be making for future assessments? So a little background, in 2019, there was the emergence of the novel coronavirus causing worldwide shutdowns in many societal sectors, including the education sector that we all work in. As a result, many schools transitioned to online learning very quickly and very rapidly. And this online learning led to a great amount of challenges both inside that virtual classroom and outside beyond that screen. And those included stress and anxiety, how to accurately assess those students. That included reliability and validity. And we're going to talk about those less affluent homes, those homes where students didn't have great access to internet. So some challenges that we faced in formal and informal assessment is that there was a varying level of instruction. Classroom instructional divergence was huge. This varied from school to school, and within those schools, it varied from teacher to teacher. This leads to varying levels of performance on those assessments. And those varying levels from teacher to teacher or school to school included technology knowledge of that skill or that professor, their technology. How proficient were they at using technology? What was their knowledge level like? So how were they able to teach that new material remotely? A lot of challenges face that. Some teachers did better than others, and that's certainly going to affect the performance on assessments of those students. So there wasn't a lot of evidence, pedagogical approaches to teaching online yet. We had to learn a lot on the fly as we went. We have a lot of more resources now to help us in the future, but at the time we didn't. So this also leads to test pollution. So we talked about the challenges that the teachers were facing and how that could impact the students. Now we're looking at when we do give that assessment, was it accurate? Was it valid? And in a lot of cases, it might not have been because of this test pollution. It leads to too much construct irrelevant variance. So were those students able to accurately prepare for that test? What situational factors? Were they stressed? Were they anxious? Students could be using notes, and this leads to the possibility of retest reliability. Classroom instructional divergence becomes online learning, leads to students being unequally prepared for these same tests. Due to this being no fault of their own, it affects the validity of an assessment because it is a factor affecting performance that is not the knowledge of the construct. So then we're going to talk about now challenges of high-stakes standardized testing. Now, the federal government waived a lot of standardized testing requirements for public schools. This led to delays in testing. So we had unequal time gaps between tests. Now we also had remote testing, which leads to a lot of the test pollution that I just mentioned in that previous slide. So this is a big issue in a lot of schools, and that delay in testing, even as schools are able to test in the fall of 2020 to make up for the missing test in the spring of 2020, there will now be a year and a half worth of growth for the first comparison, but only half a year for the growth of the second. This affects the validity of the comparison between those two time frames. That's a drastic, a whole 1 year difference between how those students are testing. So then remote testing. So prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, remote large-scale standardized testing was not widely used. Little valid evidence in specific contexts of using these scores from remote proctored high-stakes standardized testing is given. And because of that, as a result of that testing, speaking of, if we are able to give those assessments remotely, how are those students going to do? And a lot of those students might not do as well as they did in the previous year. We saw a large learning loss across all grade levels and all subjects for a variety of students, a learning loss of about 3 percentile points across all factors that we can see here. And among that, students in less educated homes with those less access to internet, they saw a 60% larger than those homes. So these students are going to be greatly affected, and it's going to impact how those standardized tests are taken in the future. Can we really compare a 2020 standardized test to a 2018 based on this learning loss? So how to assess that learning loss? How can we improve from that? We're trying our best to pick those students back up from where they're doing. And in order to know how we're doing, there was a big push for formative assessments. And formative assessments, we've learned a lot about in this class, is that they're given during instruction to collect data to drive future instruction. They give feedback both to students and teachers. So it is a time where it is crucial for teachers to assess students throughout instruction, especially during a time when the format we are given is so drastically different from any format we've given before. It's important to know how we're doing. Are these technologies we're using helping these students? Are they absorbing the material? And then considerations we should be taking for the future. So increased training in pedagogical approaches to teaching online, to have consistent practices for each school and teacher. Standardizing the resources given to kids in all public schools, to have consistency and access to technology. Consider making access to internet a right and not a luxury. Investment in test security programs, an example being web browsing blockers, visual monitoring investment. And we need to make a decision to either stop standardized testing during the pandemic or continue remotely. Having it one way or another will at least provide some consistency. So here are my references, and thank you all for joining me. And if you have any questions, please throw it in the discussion board for myself or Nathan Smarcz. Thank you both.